Hey gang, welcome back to another video. Now as a prop maker, I spend the majority of my time building things for clients. But since today is my birthday, I'm going to build myself a little something in the form of a Star Wars data panel using a digital picture frame. So let's get to it. I did the bulk of my designing in Fusion 360 so that I could try different things before I landed on this. It's loosely based on a panel inside of the Smuggler's Run ride at Disneyland, and I thought it would be a perfect addition to my collection. So once I imported the files into my laser, I could press that glowing button and get to cutting out all the panels for this build. With all my panel pieces cut out, it was time for assembly, starting with the rear boxes. Because everything is designed with finger joints, it'll make this step really quick. So with the CA glue at the ready, I got down to it. Now that the two main boxes are glued up, it's time to figure out how I'll mount them to one another. But when I found some short offcuts of tubing and a few bolts with standoffs, I knew exactly what to do. My first thought was to have the tubes only on the right side, but to prevent the MDF from sagging over time, I went with a single mounting point on each side. To keep that sort of cantilevered look, I'll use the two larger pieces of tubing on one side for more visual weight. And then I could set those parts aside and get to work on the upper frame. For this piece, I wanted to have a stepped look to it, so I cut two pieces of acrylic and will glue them together. And just to make sure that they're aligned correctly, I'll use a bit of painter's tape on one side and lift the acrylic like a book cover to apply the glue and then switch to the other. Then I can set it aside to dry. While I wait, I can get to gluing on the lower face frame. This section is also layered, but the backer panel nests inside of the box. So I'll peel off the protective paper from the acrylic, drop the panel into the box, and glue it from the inside. Once the inset panel had dried, I could flip it over and glue on the two face pieces. These will frame a few custom greeblies on the left and right hand side, and will also help to create the look of a hatch that's been left open, exposing some lights and more greeblies inside. With the lower section out of the way, I can switch my attention back to the top and mounting the face frame to the box I made earlier. This was a little tricky because the MDF had a bit of a bow to it and wasn't quite square, so I had to wrangle the pieces into place before the glue set up. And when it was set, I grabbed the lower section and my custom greeblies and had my first look at the shell of my data panel. Okay, that's enough staring. Let's get to painting those greeblies. Like with most metal paint jobs, I started by base coating these two resin prints with glossy black paint, making sure not to go too heavy, but getting a good wet application of paint. And after an hour of dry time, I grabbed my airbrush and got to applying some chrome paint to these greeblies. Having a variety of finishes on this piece will make it more visually interesting, and this paint in particular will really help the resin pieces to stand out. Because I knew that these were going to get weathered, I didn't worry about getting a high shine on the parts, and any ghosting in the finish would just look like tarnished metal, and that worked for the aesthetic I had in mind for this build. As I finished up the metal paint, I realized that I didn't have a way to get my power cord and lights routed through the data panel, so I drilled a pilot hole in the top and bottom panels, and then enlarged them with a step-up bit until it was just slightly smaller than the outer diameter of the tubing. That way I can create a pass-through without it looking like one. And speaking of lights, my design included space for 4 5mm LEDs, and to keep it interesting, 2 of them are the blinking kind. So with those labeled, I could get to installing them into the upper section of my data panel with a bit of CA glue. In this missing clip, I stripped all of the wires, joined positives with positives and negatives with negatives, and connected it to a temporary power supply to see how it all looked. The white and red blinking LEDs run at different speeds, so I'm happy with them being spaced out the way they are. I may swap one of them out if the flashing gets too annoying, but for now I can set it aside and move on to the greeblies that will be installed in the hatch section of the lower panel. I found a broken coffee maker on my neighborhood Buy Nothing Facebook group, and after disassembling it, I found this piece, which is exactly the same height as the panel opening. So I'm going to use this as the base and build onto it for the final panel. To add a bit of depth to this piece, I grabbed a bit of EVA foam and used it to offset this cable assembly, since the solder joints on the back made it nearly impossible for it to lay flat. So with the two pieces of foam, I could glue them to the circuit board and to each other, and then it was time for paint. I started with a matte black base layer, making sure to get into all of the recesses. And when it had dried, I noticed the circuit board wasn't quite wide enough. So I mixed up some 5-minute epoxy and attached it to a scrap piece of MDF that was cut to fit the opening in the lower body panel. I also grabbed some old radio parts from another build to fill out the remaining space. Up next is the screen bezel, which, with the help of some creative video editing, will allow me to make the single photo frame look like multiple screens. This piece was 3D printed and can get glued into the upper frame with the help of some 1-2-3 blocks. Once I saw it all together, I decided that it needed a bit of help to stand out. So I grabbed some metallic paint and a sponge and applied the paint to the front edge, which should help to give it a bit more definition and an almost mid-century retro-futurism look. While the bezel dries, I'll do a bit of dry brushing on my greeblie panel to help give it a bit more definition as well. I'm using a slightly darker metallic paint to give some variety in the finish, and I'm making sure to really work the paint around to remove any obvious brush strokes. Off camera, I added in some baffles to close off the lower opening so that I wouldn't need to fill the entire area, and then I could glue in my greeblie panel and move on to assembly. After a quick assembly, I flipped the panel over to install the digital photo frame with a bit of VHB, or very high bond, tape. This will save me the trouble of having to come up with a bracket for the picture frame to nest into. Plus, I'll probably keep the frame in here permanently, and so this seemed like the best approach. And once the protective strip was removed from the tape, I could press the picture frame into place and get a look at my fully assembled data panel. But even better, let's see it with the animation playing. I found these clips shared by Oddball Fett on the Replica Prop forum, and I edited them together into one video to create the effect of there being 4 screens. This is an idea that I got from Tony at Docking Bay 327, and I'll leave a link to his video in the description if you want to know more about it. With the building part out of the way, it's time to give this data panel some personality, starting with decals. I made these 3 decal sheets based on graphics I'd seen around Galaxy's Edge, which are available now in my Etsy shop, and I'll apply a few of them around the panel and then can get to the final step of weathering. For this prop, I'll be using oil paints, starting with black to give it a greasy look, and then following it up with a dark brown to add some variety. This will get brushed around the surface and into all of the recesses, and then wiped away until I'm happy with how it looks. Then I can set it aside to dry and call this data panel done. Now, it's been a minute since I tackled a Star Wars project, but this was a fun little exercise that I think will fit in nicely with the rest of my collection. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.